from every corner of our city, Boston has spoken. We are ready to meet this moment. We are ready to become a Boston for everyone.
Michelle Wu said she is ready to meet this moment after being elected Boston's new mayor. Her victory seemed both improbable and somehow inexorable. The Chicago-born daughter of Taiwanese immigrants shattered multiple barriers in being elected the city's first woman mayor, first mayor of color, and first Asian American mayor. But for all the shock that delivered to Boston's parochial ways, electing a Harvard-educated policy wonk who promised a city-level Green New Deal also seemed to meet the moment in a city that's been transformed by an influx of more educated, progressive-leaning residents. They seemed ready for a mayor who will fill potholes and chart a bold vision for change, which is the dual promise Wu made in her victory speech. So how did Michelle Wu pull off her landslide win, and what will she do with that electoral mandate for change? I'm Michael Jonas from Commonwealth Magazine. Helping us break down the new Wu-niverse we're inhabiting are two reporters who covered the race closely. Yawu Miller is senior editor at the Bay State Banner. Thanks for joining us, Yawu.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
And Gin Dumcius is the managing editor of the Dorchester Reporter. Gin, great to have you.
Good to be here. Thanks.
So, Gin, help us understand sort of what just happened. The final election between Michelle Wu and Anissa Asabi George, two at-large Boston city councilors, wasn't even close in the end. Wu won by 28 points, and it really looked like it would be a blowout from the start. What happened?
Well, I think we actually saw on the preliminary night, there was a poll that came out at 8:00 just as the polls closed, and they had a head-to-head matchup of Wu and all the other candidates, and the one that Wu did best against was Anissa Asabi George. Anissa ran she had a lane in the preliminary that more or less evaporated or she couldn't grow the lane in the final election. And I'll say this: I've been kind of going back over my first time at the Dorchester Reporter back in 2013, and that was when Michelle Wu launched her city council at large campaign. And it was funny just to see how consistent she's been in her messaging and bringing together an inclusive coalition, talking about her biography, but also about policies. And, I know there's been a lot of talk about how she's been planning this mayoral run for 8 years. And I think there's some truth to that. But there's also a remarkable consistency for her over the course of her political career.
And I think you make a really good point that the election outcome was certainly, the first point being the credit to Wu and what she's represented, the campaign she ran, and the appeal she had. But, every race really comes down to a choice, and I think you're right that the opponent she ended up with in the final, Anissa Asabi George, was, as you say, the one that polls showed she would do best against. So that had certainly a big role in the outcome. And Yawu, talk a little about that dynamic, and I guess also just how the electorate in the city has changed. You wrote recently a great piece looking at some of those changes, how some of the kind of historically, powerhouse voting sections of the city, Dorchester and South Boston, chief among them, which happen to be areas that Anissa Asabi George really leaned on heavily, have seen sort of a decrease in their clout in elections and other shifts that have seen other neighborhoods kind of rise in their voting power.
Yeah, I mean, Boston's always had like a lot of immigration, a lot of people coming in, and particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen more immigrants, but also an infusion more recently of tech workers, people in biotech, people in finance. And as housing prices have gone up and the city's population has increased, it's forced out a lot of working class Bostonians. I think a lot of people who've been focusing on displacement of long-term residents have been looking at Black and Latino residents, many who've been moving to communities like Brockton or Randolph. But it's also hit in South Boston and in the white sections of Dorchester. It's hit those communities particularly hard. I think what we saw really with Anissa's race is that even between 2013, when Marty Walsh depended on those same precincts in Dorchester and South Boston to make it into make it through the preliminary. And now, there are fewer voters, so that, that those communities gave Anissa less of an advantage. And then, as again pointed out, she was in that lane and stayed in that lane, failed to break out of that, where Marty was able to get the support of the Black and Latino candidates who ran against him in the mayoral preliminary, as well as Black elected officials. Anissa was not.
Yeah, that seems like a huge difference. Even though I was going to say, in some ways, I think Asabi George probably went into this thing thinking, I'm going to run. I'm in the Marty Walsh mold. They grew up on the same street. They were close allies. Why shouldn't I be able to kind of run the same kind of race and win, just as he did only 8 years ago? But there were a lot of things that shifted within the city, and also certainly, again, back to this idea that every race is kind of a choice of two options, and certainly Michelle Wu kind of was a very different candidate, projecting a different background and appeal than John Connolly was, even though there's always some overlap, but I think that was sort of not something that worked at all in Anissa's favor. I was just struck that not only is there sort of maybe less voting power in some of those areas, but the turnover in areas of, say, Dorchester and South Boston were such that when I looked at just the precinct level numbers, I believe, if I have this right, that Anissa Sabi George carried, not by an enormous amount, but carried the precinct where she lives, but the immediately adjacent precincts in her own Dorchester neighborhood went to Wu. That just was sort of striking to me.
I was actually at so before heading over to the Wu event, I actually swung through the Kit Clark apartments. I think that's the one you're referring to, right? The Catherine Clark apartments right by the Banshee there. I picked up the polling numbers, and I had to do a double take because Wu won. It's a double precinct, and Wu won both precincts. I kept looking at the numbers, and I see Frank Baker handily won.
He's the local district city councilor there. Again, kind of an Anissa Sabi George ally, and sort of in the same, definitely sort of more politically moderate mold.
Yeah, and that was kind of getting those results, and that's when I kind of knew it wasn't going to be close at all. It was going to be a Wu blowout after seeing those numbers.
Right. So Yawu, what did the sort of what's the overarching kind of message you took from the outcome?
It's a different city than it was even 10 years ago, or even 8 years ago when Marty Walsh ran. That the people like me, people like you who were here during desegregation, are a minority of Boston residents and Boston voters. I looked at the Washington Post. They had a map. They have a map of the United States. You can look at any census tract and see how it's changed. So many of the precincts that were predominantly white have become more heterogeneous, more Black, more Latino, more Asian. But also a lot of the precincts in Roxbury and Ward 14, which goes from like the Grove Hall area into Mattapan, they've become more like a little less Black and more Latino. And I think what was most surprising to me is, I'm sorry, I'm getting into the nerdy precinct demographic weeds, but
we're here for it, Yawu.
The area in Hyde Park, Fairmount and Reedville, those two areas are now majority people of color. Now they came out heavily for Anissa, or somewhat strongly for Anissa, but I think the voter participation. I have been focusing a lot on predominantly white areas like South Boston, but voter participation is kind of dropping everywhere in the city. We've seen that, even as the number of people of Boston residents is increasing, newcomers of all races are less likely to vote. I mean, perhaps in Mattapan and Hyde Park, because Haitian people who come here, don't yet have citizenship. A lot of the numbers you see are young people who are not of voting age. Certainly a lot of the immigration has been fueled by Dominicans and Central Americans who don't come here with the right to vote. So yeah, just a decrease in voter participation everywhere. And as at the same time that the population of the city is increasing.
And talk a little bit about the appeal that Wu had to the electorate. I've seen some folks commenting that she managed to somehow appeal to kind of young, left-leaning activists really eager to shake things up, but she didn't really, I think, as some people have put it, scare off necessarily more moderate voters. Certainly, Asabi George had a hold on some chunk of those moderate voters, but Wu won lots of votes from people who might be considered more moderate or, kind of, sort of traditional, sort of more liberal-leaning Democrats, not super lefty activists. Now, maybe some critics said, one criticism was that, Wu was sometimes short on real specifics, so that can, help you to sort of have a broader appeal. I mean, is that really what it was, or is there something more to her ability to kind of have that kind of reach across the electorate?
Yeah, I think people really responded to her ideas 20 years ago, and throughout Boston history, like in the last 100 years, ethnicity mattered way more than ideas. Ethnicity and where a candidate was from. And I think that equation is kind of flipped on its head, particularly because people don't have as strong a connection to their neighborhoods, not in the same way that people had, even 20 years ago in Boston, and also, people the electorate is more racially heterogeneous, so race doesn't matter as much. She came with bold ideas, and I think that the electorate is way more in tune with voting for things like mitigating climate change, because we have a younger electorate. Making the MBTA free. The electorate is more progressive. I think a lot of those changes have been happening sort of gradually over the last 20 years.
And I mean, to that point, I think I talked earlier in the week with Larry DeCara, the former city councilor and longtime watcher of city politics going back to the 70s, and he said without a doubt she will be the most, as he put it, the most cerebral mayor we've had since Kevin White. And I think he meant she is somebody who really kind of trafficked in ideas and big, bold, kind of approaches to problems the city's facing. And I think that he's really right that, we haven't seen that since Kevin White left in the early 80s. We had a succession of mayors, I mean, with some variation, that were much sort of operated kind of more close to the ground. I mean, Tom Menino famously just sort of, dismissed the idea of broad vision as not relevant to running cities. So we are in for a very different kind of leader in the city.
Interestingly, when she came in 2013, she was way more moderate than she is now. She was against rent control until, even in 2019, when asked by JP Progressives whether she would support it, she initially said she would not. She was pushed by that group and sort of by, I think there's been an increase in grassroots activisms. The progressive mass chapters in Boston have really pushed things, as well as, other groups like the Sunrise Movement, the various Black Lives Matter movements, such as For the People, have pushed candidates like Wu to embrace more progressive ideals. And she also is going to have a more progressive council. It appears that way, given who got elected that she will have political support on the council to and probably pressure from the council to stick to that progressive agenda.
And so talk a little again about, I mean, what that turning a little to the question of, what do we know or think about how she will govern? She, is she going to be, a disruptor or, this radical change agent that I think, again, there's some segment of the folks who worked for her and put her into office really see her as that, and that's what they are hoping for? Or is that sort of a misread of someone who is more of a kind of savvy and strategic political player? I think, as Yawu said, there's been some evolution in her political makeup, I think. I mean, but she, if you go back, she worked for a consulting firm for a year after college, and it was 8 years ago now, but some remember kind of her first move when she was first elected to the council was this kind of deal making with the then South Boston City Councilor Bill Linehan that just had liberal activists enraged, where she promised him her vote in the first, her first act on the council for city council president. I was going back and looking at some articles, not from that year, but then her first re-election at the council in 2015. I was just reading a great article in the Globe where she kind of had to go on sort of, bended knee to different groups like the JP Progressives, and they held back an endorsement. And as the Globe article put it, that, one condition for their endorsement was that she show sufficient contrition, and they didn't rule that she had done that. The Ward 5 committee in the Back Bay, which also was not happy with her vote, did end up giving her, maybe a little bit grudgingly, their endorsement that year. And it was interesting to see they also endorsed that same year Ayanna Pressley and Anissa Asabi George, who I think won. That was her first year that she won. So it was just interesting to go back and see how the landscape looked back then. And so, I mean, how do you see her governing? In what mold will she be in? Or, and will she, disappoint some of the kind of activists that have seen in her, kind of Elizabeth Warren-like, fiery kind of disruptor? Or is she, on the other hand, she's got Tom Menino, who she worked for as an intern, as a mentor as well.
Well, I think activists are at some point are going to be disappointed. That seems to be kind of part and parcel of being an activist, and that kind of purity test that sometimes comes into play, especially during the election season, is why I'm happy to remain unaffiliated. But in terms of kind of what she's going to govern like, I think she's a very strategic thinker, and I think just from talking with her and talking with others, I've made this analogy before. It's not a perfect one because she doesn't actually play chess, but I do think that she walks into a room full of chessboards and she knows where every piece is and she knows what moves to make on every single board. So it's kind of staggering to kind of zoom out and think about exactly how she's going to get to some of the policy proposals that she's talked about. But I think I told you after one of the scrums, I had a conversation with Joe Aiello, who oversaw the MBTA oversight board. So for 6 years, so he saw quite a few MBTA budgets, and I was very curious to talk to him because it's the MBTA is this beast that's often been drenched in red ink, and I want to know why are you supporting Michelle Wu? And he said, she's already changed the conversation on fair, free MBTA with just pushing it. He said she brings people to the table who might disagree with her. And the other thing was the strategic thinking. He said, and this is a paraphrase, he said, if a fair, free MBTA is a trip to Jupiter, Michelle Wu knows how to build the space program to get there, which was kind of struck me. And the one other ironic thing I'll mention is that while I was on the phone with him, I was actually on the commuter rail heading home and getting chased through the train car for my fare, ironically. So I did pay.
No free fare yet, right?
No free fare yet. No, I had activated the which is the little app thing, but they hadn't seen it yet. So, but yeah, so I think that's kind of what we're going to see. She's a very strategic thinker, and there's going to be activists on some sides that will be disappointed, but that's going to happen in any sort of governing situation.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that in the preliminary, she did not have the support of many Black elected officials or Latino elected officials, and also community-based building groups such as the Chinese Progressive Association, the Asian American Resource Workshop, Right to the City Vote, and Mi Gente. So representing Black, Latino, and Asian groups, they did not endorse her. They voted. They endorsed Kim Janey. So I think she's going to get a good deal. I imagine she's going to get a good deal of pressure from those groups, because I don't think that there's a longstanding relationship with her. So they're going to be pushing her to on issues like rent control. She's promised a lot, and she has a lot to deliver on.
Right. And I think as the rent control and the T are the two big examples that kept coming up during the election. These are big promises she made, big issues that kind of captured the imagination of voters that really depend on state government, the legislature, and the governor for sign-off. I think rent control seems particularly questionable, whether she's going to get much traction on that. I think the T thing, and maybe Gin's point, is an interesting one, and the fact that Joe Aiello, the former head of the MBTA control board, ended up endorsing her is something where, again, she's a strategic thinker. She's already made clear that the first priority is going to be focusing on free fare for buses. And for one thing, the price tag on that is way less than kind of this shoot the moon, have the entire system go free. And it also just hits on a lot of the issues. There's almost begins to be, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish, a little convergence with, Anissa Sabi-George said, we should be looking at targeted, fare support for low-income riders and the sort of things that, seem, again, more incremental. Well, sort of free fare on buses is exactly that. I mean, that is a population that tends to be more low-income. It's also kind of a change that really can affect the delivery of the service. Fare collection really impedes the speed of bus trips in a way that it doesn't really interfere with the subway system. So there's a lot of reason to think she may kind of just put a lot of her eggs in that basket and see, what she can do. And she has already these examples in Boston and some other cities where this has begun to happen. We had her on the podcast a few years ago when she just was first talking about this. And it, again, seemed to use the term that came up over and over in the campaign this year, very pie in the sky like when she was talking about free fare. But we've seen in the years since then that in a lot of ways she was ahead of the curve in terms of where thinking is going nationally and even in Boston.
And next year, voters in Massachusetts will likely vote on the fair share amendment, still called millionaire's tax. If that passes, it could raise a couple $2 billion, which would be dedicated to education, K through 12 and public higher ed, as well as transportation, which includes roads and bridges, but also the MBTA. So the money could actually be there as soon as next year to offset the loss of revenue from fares.
Yeah, which would be pretty interesting. And in terms of just her overall approach to governing, I'm struck again that if you sort of pull out sort of the two most prominent sort of mentors and the people she's mentioned in her speech and that she's talked about a lot, one is Elizabeth Warren and the other is Tom Menino, and, two very different figures. And I guess I'm struck by the fact that, she's taking the job that Menino had, and I wonder if she will, have to operate somewhat more in that mode. I mean, both Warren and Ayanna Pressley, who she's also, given a lot of shout outs to, they both have the kind of luxury, you might say, of, trying to sort of shake up the system, as sort of advocates / legislators. They don't actually we're not in charge of running something. That's sort of the big difference that I think, makes me wonder if she's going to end up sort of veering more in some ways toward the sort of pragmatic, approach that Menino took with, again, she's not going to be a carbon copy of him in any way, but I just think that that's a big difference.
Yeah, I think, I guess two things on that, just from what I saw on the campaign trail. One was there was a forum on at Morningstar Baptist with her and Asabi George, and Wu was basically told, like, well, you've got time constraints, you can't, you got to answer this question. And she said, okay, I'm going to do some nitty gritty and some big. And I think that kind of summed up kind of where she was trying to steer the campaign towards. I think she was having the talking about the big ideas, but she was also trying to thread it with the kind of like talking about city sewers. I'll say the thing that struck me when I was on the campaign trail with Wu on a Saturday, there was a Charlestown house party, and the permitting process came up for the city, and she said, like the building inspectors are overworked and understaffed. So they are responding to the people who are bugging them the most about permits and all that stuff. And she said, if we hire a dozen or so administrative assistants for these building inspectors, that could quadruple their productivity, which it was a very granular answer that kind of struck me, that she is able to focus both on the small things that can have a big impact, a big ripple effect, while at the same time talking about something pie in the sky, potentially like fare free MBTA.
And she hit on that again in her victory speech. We can sort of have both that kind of dual focus of very close to the ground and the big vision ideas. I mean, I'm struck by how little attention, maybe that's true in general of campaigns. I mean, people are sort of speaking more thematically, but I was just struck by how little we heard about, ideas that the candidates had, or certainly from Wu about, kind of real basic city services. That just didn't seem to be the thing that was kind of animating the campaign. But I think you're right that, she, again, going back to her background when she worked as an intern under Menino, she talked to me about how she was sort of put on the task of looking at issues around school bus route, logistics, or, she's got a big interest in licensing issues for small businesses. So I think that's a big dimension of what the mayor does. And I think it's also an area where, there's room for a lot of innovation. It's nuts and bolts stuff, but, there's a lot of cutting edge thinking and sort of practical doing that she could bring to bear, depending also on who she brings in. One other last thing is, I mean, it seems the biggest hire she's going to make, apart from filling out her own staff, is the police commissioner. I mean, we have an acting police commissioner. She signaled just now this week after the election that she's ready to kind of work with the school superintendent. So talk about whether there could be another change there seems that's not going to happen. So the other, the biggest job in city government, other biggest job is the police commissioner. What do you guys look for there? Do you think she is going to sort of have her sights set on looking outside the city, which a lot of, reform activists have called for?
I don't have a clear sense of what she's going to do, but, so there's also sort of a long list of reforms that people want to see enacted that have really evaded us since, 1992 or 93, when the St. Clair Commission report came out, looking for, that had a raft of reforms, including independent oversight of the police, which, we finally have. She's going to have to make that real, it really hasn't yet been tested. The oversight board, the new oversight board, people are going to be looking at her to settle lawsuits that Black and Latino officers have filed against the city and won judgments in, and then the city has appealed them to death. So, people are going to look, Black officers and Latino officers are going to be looking for settlements, women who've been discriminated against within the police department. So people in the Black community want to see a more diverse police department that reflects the communities. Latinos and Asians are certainly underrepresented on the force. And people want to see a police force that responds to the community in a sympathetic way, rather than acting as a sort of outside or occupying force.
Well, we are. It's sort of fun to speculate, and we don't really have to wait that long to begin to see what she is going to do. The transition this time around is very short, because we've been, the city's been run by an acting mayor. So Michelle Wu takes office in just a little bit over a week, and we'll begin to get some answers to all these questions. So I want to thank you both, Yawu Miller and again Dumcius, for talking with us today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Good to be here.
And thank you all for listening. I'm Michael Jonas at Commonwealth Magazine. We'll see you next week.